Well, thank you very much for attending this conference. It's a great privilege to be here. It's a privilege because I'm going to share with you some of the reasons why the work you're doing is essential and important with respect to the bigger context. Not just the context here at the University of California, San Diego, or higher education generally, but with respect to what's going on in our world. We are actually working on the most important defining problem of our time, which is how do we improve social mobility? And the reason this is so important, the reason this is so important, the first intellectual to figure this out, the connection between whether we solve this problem and whether we survive as a species, was Stephen Hawking. Now, this might seem very histrionic and dramatic, but I'm going to show you why Stephen Hawking was convinced this is such a critical problem for our world. First, let's think about a little bit let's do a little bit of experiment. How many people here are parents? How many of you have children? Oh, quite a few. That's wonderful. And of those who just raised their hand, how many of you love your children? Right? Well, that's good. That's promising. We do have a future. But let me ask you the tough, there's no right answer here, but I'm going to ask you a moral philosophic question, and that is, do you love your children so much that if they were in grave danger, you'd take a bullet for them? How many of you would do that? That's impressive. Thank you. I feel the same way. But now those of you who didn't raise your hand or don't have children, understand that energy which has been so valuable to the human species, to protect our children, to protect the future for our children, could actually factor paradoxically in the demise of the species. This is something that Hawking understood, that if justice for the future is not established, we're willing to bet everything for it. And we live in a nuclear-tipped era, and that's dangerous. So one of the triggers for his thought before he died was the passing of Brexit, and it's in the news now, which is the exit of Britain from the European Union. This seems like a step backwards to try to think about Britain as the empire on which the sun never sets, to go back and revert. What's going on? Well, what they found out was the people who voted voted for Brexit were people from the boroughs and counties in Britain who don't have opportunity. They're surrounded by torpor. There's no upward movement in their society, except outside of London, or except in London itself. And so they decided, heck with all this globalization. I don't buy it. It doesn't work for me. Something else. I'll just try anything else. And so, why is this a problem? Why is it a problem when a society comes to the point where the rich are vastly rich and the poor are underserved? What's the problem here? What was the connection that Hawking was able to understand? Well, this has been articulated very well by a Stanford history professor who just last year wrote a book called The Great Leveler. And he goes through examples in history, and I'm going to show you some of these examples so you can see why in fact, there is a correlation. There's a correlation just like, okay, social mobility. I can't prove to you that if we don't solve the problem of social mobility, we're going to have nuclear war. I can't do that because nobody can predict the future. But I also can't predict whether I take up smoking, whether I'm going to get lung cancer. I still can't predict that. But the connection is correlative. We've connected cigarette smoking as a risk factor to cancer. We've done that epidemiologically through statistics. Well, there's not enough data points in history to really say that if societies grow unequal, that therefore there is going to be war conflagration. But there's a heck of a lot of points, and this is what Professor Scheidel demonstrates for us. Okay, so let's go back to the Middle Ages, and let's think about justice in society as a simple balance beam. All right? Now, back then, you had absolute wealth inequality. You had the church, and you had the kings, and you had the nobles, and that was it. Everybody else was poor. But to counterbalance that were the pieties of the time. People believed that it was harder for a rich man to go to heaven than it was for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. Okay? It was also believed that everyone was equal in the eyes of God. And therefore, that's what counts. Of course, the afterlife is what really counts. It's not what's happening here on earth. We've actually got an advantage as peasants because we're poor, okay? This is good. But we also, the infrastructure of the time was cathedrals. I could go in a cathedral, no matter the fact that I'm a peasant, I have access to that cathedral. I have access to that infrastructure just like all the kings and nobles do. So there was enough of an imbalance, but it wasn't cracking until the church blew it. The church introduced indulgences, okay? Which was, okay, if you consort with your mistress and you're not faithful to your wife, no problem. You can pay us and be exempt from that. The peasants said, no way. This is absurd. This is obscene. We will not tolerate it. They will not tolerate social justice. And they went to war with their pitchforks and their shovels. And they said, enough. We can't have this. And so the nobility slaughtered the peasants. 500,000 people died. And the outcome was that the church finally rescinded the notion of indulgences. But Martin Luther established the schism of the Protestant Revolution. He hammered his proclamation on the church door. He said, no, we can't behave like this. So peace was ensued for a couple of hundred years. Again, this time only 500,000 people died. But then, about the time of the formation of the United States of America, they blew it. The aristocracy blew it in Europe, and they imposed taxes on the poor, and again broke the scale of justice. What happened next? Well, of course, that was actually why this country was founded, because we were founded as a rebellion against taxation. Well, this time, instead of 500,000 people being slaughtered, 5 million people were killed in the French Revolutionary Wars. All right? So you're starting to see the connection here? That maybe social injustice, if it's not redressed, the great leveler has to come in, war conflagration. 2 data points. Let's look at another one. This is from the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. This is as capitalist as you get. But here they say, and you can read it, the United Kingdom, Germany, France not only exhibited extremely high wealth and income inequality before the war, World War I, but their inequality was at a historical peak. The ingredients necessary for a large conflict were present. All it took was some kind of spark. Again, who could predict that the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand would trigger this massive conflagration, that this time not 5 million people killed 30 million people. All right, so in the aftermath of World War I, peace, quote unquote, is established. Reparations are opposed in Germany, and the people of Germany couldn't stomach it. They couldn't stomach it. They were oppressed. They said this is in defiance of the great pride of the German experience. And to the fore rose this dictator, Adolf Hitler, who said, we're going to make Germany great again. What happened? What happened? This time, 80 million people died. Okay? So again, the balance is broken, and the great leveler comes in. We know we live in a nuclear-tipped era. What happens next time? It's not good. We don't know. I can't predict, but we have data points that show if we don't redress this issue, if we don't do the great work that you're doing here to make higher education a conduit against social immobility, we may suffer this fate. We may have the same risk that a smoker has as an individual or great societies have, because they've allowed this structural problem to occur. So right now, we're in the American dream, right? No, I'm sorry, we're the least economically mobile among all developed nations. You can look that up on the internet. It's easy to see. It was published in 2014 by David Otter, MIT economist. And such capitalist magazines as Fortune published stories about this. The U.S. levels of wealth and inequality are approaching the extremes of the Belle Epoque. The Belle Epoque was a period in Europe before World War I, where Jane Austen was writing her novels and so on about, well, the way you get ahead is you marry into money. You marry into property. And we have this strange thing that's never happened before in a developed nation, where the retiring generation is actually better educated than the incoming generation. That's wrong. Doesn't make any sense. But guess what? The reason if you want to disrupt, if you want to innovate, boy, are you in a great place. Not only are you dealing with Hawking's problem, not only are you dealing with the most important defining problem of our time, but you have the means that are so necessary to distribute. Okay, back during the medieval times, if you wanted to spread wealth evenly, it was an agrarian problem. How do you distribute the land? In the industrial area, it was factories. In the knowledge age, it was information. But we're in the learning age. Things are changing so fast that the people who have the opportunity to move forward are the ones who are really good at learning. This is the place where that happens. This is the place where that power is distributed. So the fact that you are bringing that power to the so-called underserved is dramatic and important and speaks to solving this great problem of our time. That's why I'm proud to be here. That's why I'm so proud to be here, and I'm proud of what you're doing. But you also need to understand that what you're doing fits in a bigger context. Because when you understand that it fits in a bigger context, you will become more ambitious. You'll become more ambitious to take the example of your work and publish more about it so you can influence higher education generally in the United States of America and in the world, because it's screwed up. And I'll show you that. First of all, we need to improve inclusion. Real economic inclusion in higher education. Not fake, but real. Okay? Here's what we have right now. Our levelers now, we have income inequality, we have wealth inequality at record levels, but we've added education to the tray. That's causing some cracks in social justice. Right now we have a few things that you really can't touch politically because they are false levelers. They give a sense of power. They have the ability to carry an AK-47. I got a sense of power. I got a sense of freedom. Okay? I have the ability to vote. I could also win the lottery. You know what I mean? It could happen to me. I could win the lottery. So I've got this sense that, hey, maybe it's okay. I got a smartphone. My smartphone actually isn't the latest generation, but it's pretty close to what Jeff Bezos has. Hey, that's cool. How long is that going to last? If education stays in that tray, and education is the most important thing that you can deliver in the learning age, the reason it's gone awry is because we've had the tuition bomb since the 1980s. In the 1980s, the federal government said, sorry, you guys protested the Vietnam War, you're on your own, you're a business. And tuition just started to spiral out of control. I'm in the admissions game. When you apply to graduate school at Stanford, Princeton, and so on, you're actually applying through technology provided by CollegeNET. Okay? So we started to see what's going on in the admissions game. The admissions game is stacked for the rich. Standardized testing. What's the number one correlator for high SAT score? Anybody know? Family income. Absolutely. So if you're selecting for high SAT score, you're deprecating the chances to work with a brilliant guy like Jeff. You're saying, sorry, dude, you're not good enough. Is that wrong? I'm also a late bloomer, by the way. Yeah, baby. The other thing that's happened is that, okay, U.S. News & World Report was also ran among the three, Newsweek, Time, back in the 80s. They were in danger of going out of business. Well, they came up with this idea, well, maybe we could rank universities, right? And so they instituted the U.S. News & World Report rankings, which basically are nothing but an echo of prevailing opinion about what constitutes prestige and best. That's what that is. And guess what? It's taken on this life since the middle 80s, since the sort of Gilded Age. We're going to bring back the entrepreneur. We're going to bring back rich and wealth. Wall Street, the movie Wall Street, greed is good, this type of thing. During that era, it was hatched this to save U.S. News & World Report, the empire from Mort Zuckerman, sitting in his Manhattan office tower, right? To rate universities primarily on what? On opinion surveys of other officials at other universities, essentially perpetuating privilege, perpetuating the common knowledge, the common opinions, the common beliefs, without any lens at all on this critical, important problem of social mobility. None. In fact, acting counter to solving this problem because it celebrates hoarding endowments. Okay? You can rank higher in the U.S. News & World Report ranking if your endowment is bigger. You hang on to more of it instead of distributing it and helping it and using it to help the underserved populations. Again, the SAT score, it's all about the rich. We also have, that's why I said real inclusion's important, because we have this kind of fig leaf that all the schools use. Everybody knows access and inclusion's important. Everybody knows that. I don't care whether you go to Harvard, you go to Princeton, you come to UCSD, everybody knows access is really important, right? So what's the fig leaf? The fig leaf is a certain number of Pell recipients. I have a certain number of Pell recipients. That's the metric that's used. But this Brookings Institution survey article shows that this is actually a mirage. And if you look at the IPEDS data, as we have, you see that increasingly the percentage of students who are getting Pell Grants who are above $48,000 income per year is growing every year. There are 50 universities right now in the United States of America where over 50% of their Pell Grant recipients are above the median income. Some families are making more than $100,000 a year because the financial aid administrators are very clever about doing so-called exclusions. You can do exclusions for orthodontia. You can do exclusions for your siblings' private school education. You can do all kinds of things to pare back income and allow you to qualify for a Pell Grant. Did you know that? But yet, this is the fig leaf that the top schools use. They say, well, look, we've increased our Pell Grant recipients by 15%. Isn't that great and virtuous? And they might be talking about a sliver of their student population of 1%. Oh, instead of having 50 people now, we have 65 people who are Pell Grant recipients. Aren't we virtuous? We got to tear away the fig leaf, and we got to get to solving this problem. Because if all we're doing is choosing for wealth, this is systemically racist because this is what the wealth profile looks like for black families and for Hispanic families compared to Asians and the rest of the Caucasian population. If you're selecting for wealth, you're marginalizing blacks and Hispanics. Is that right in a pluralistic society? I don't think so. Okay, here's the academic argument. Here's the argument I think is the coolest that you can make for diversity and inclusion, is that economic inclusion strengthens development of critical thinking skills. It's not just a feel-good aesthetic or a sop to social justice or some kind of Benetton. Remember they had those advertisements where we showed people of all those different colors so they could basically peddle T-shirts and whatnot? No. This is really, really important to have economic inclusion on a university campus because it creates the opportunities for collisions, for challenges, for dealing with people who aren't like you are, who don't go to the same country club you used to go to. See? And why is that important? Well, because we all learn how to do basic critical thinking. I went to a top university too, fine. Okay, you learn how to eviscerate the ideas of somebody else. That's Washington, D.C. is filled with people who are very skilled at that. I'm right, you're wrong, and here's why. Okay? That's basic critical thinking. But advanced critical thinking, the kind of critical thinking that creates innovation and disruption, is inward to oneself. The ability to take one's own ideas as a kind of template and beat them up, okay? And the chances of that happening are greater if you're encountering people that don't see it quite the way you did. Think about some of the great discoveries that have occurred so I can prove this to you. Do you think that the people who first figured out that the earth was not flat were born that way? No, they went outside like everybody else and mom and dad told them the earth is flat, okay? But they began to see the ships going over the horizon. They got some data points that didn't quite agree with that. And they began to question their own ideas because they were encountering information that was not the same as what they were used to. Okay? That's advanced critical thinking, the ability to actually learn. In essence, not just to collect more information. That's one type of learning, like Francis Bacon said, it's like the ant, you just collect more stuff. No, it's like the honeybee. You're able to take nectar and pollen and turn it into the sweetness, something different. You're willing to challenge what it is that you're actually thinking. Same thing with the geocentric, and he used to be believed, of course, that the Earth was the center of the universe. Duh. And you could see that the sun clearly was traversing around the Earth because you just get up every morning and watch it. Duh. Do you think the people who figured out that that was not the case, the Copernicuses and so on, do you think that they were born that way? No, they actually had to revolt against their own ideas. And this is the critical importance in a higher education institution of economic inclusion. You need to see, first of all, to develop empathy, but secondly, to be challenged and understand that some of these people here, you're working with them and you're proud of them because you know what? They have this capacity to strive. You've seen it. That's a beautiful thing. I don't care what your economic class is. If you can see somebody actually kicking ass who's working really hard, that's inspiring. It doesn't come necessarily if all you're doing is hanging out with other kids from the right country clubs. But it can happen here. It can happen at the great institution that you folks are serving. Okay, we have the same thing happening here in the United States as what Stephen Hawking observed. If you actually understand why Trump has become successful, it's because he's getting votes from, or his constituencies are in counties in the United States of America where there is very little economic opportunity. Yeah, there's some rich people, but there's not a whole lot of advancement opportunity. I don't mean to pick on Cleveland, but it's places around Cleveland, okay? So here's the solution. Here's a solution that's going to help us all. It's going to help the working man. It's going to really help us out. And that is to basically start fighting with our partners. We're going to win. We're going to win. America's going to win. We're going to fight against China because they've exploited us. And there is a problem here. This is correct. There is a problem here, and that is the U.S. Relative lack of competitiveness in terms of exports. The United States of America, the net trade deficit last year was $500 billion, okay? That's a disgorgement of $500 billion in wealth to other countries. Now, I think the solution to that is education. You educate your populace, right? But that's just me. But it is a problem, and we do need to address it. But the unspoken problem that folks aren't talking about is this one, that 10% of the people in this country own 75% of the wealth, right? The remaining 90% own 25% of the wealth. Okay? Fine, right? Well, look what's happening now. That wealth gap is increasing. Not only is the wealth gap increasing, but it's increasing more each year. And last year, 2017, it increased $3.4 trillion. Okay? So basically, the bottom 90% of the population, let's put it this way. You have $100, right? And I have $100, okay? And now the gap is you have $80 and I have $120. That's a $40 gap, an increase in the gap. That's effectuated by you handing me a $20 bill, right? So you look at the delta here, which is $3.4 trillion divided by 2. That tells you the wealth transfer that occurred last year from the supermajority of this country, 90%, to the top 10%, $1.7 trillion, which is 3 times the trade deficit, okay? How are we going to win on that problem? Who's talking about solving that problem? This is an example of the core issue that's occurring in the United States of America right now. And that you folks are working to help solve. Because you're saying, let's spread the means of production. Let's spread the power to learn. Okay, and a lot of people, we have a sense, there's a great division now in the United States of America, no question. You can see it in the politics. And there's a belief that there's a lot of kooky beliefs out there. There's a lot of beliefs that it's a conspiracy. It's got to do, 50% of Americans now believe in conspiracy theories. They believe, for example, 50% don't believe this, but this is an example, that there was some kind of Illuminati out there in the 50s who planned all this sort of thing, and that the rest of us are in serfdom, and there's a few billionaires out there. That was all planned in the 50s. I don't know. I think it's real hard to predict the future. Okay? But we now understand, as a consequence of big data and some of the work that's happened out of University of California, Berkeley, and in France, Thomas Piketty, that there actually is a correlation. It's called R is greater than G, that explains in arithmetic terms what's happening in capitalism. That is, if the rate of return on capital, which generally worldwide across all asset classes is about 5%, okay, that's the average return. If that return is greater than the growth in income in a cohort, then the economy is going to diverge. The richer are going to get richer and the poor are going to get poorer. Now that even assumes that the increase in income for a particular society is spread evenly, which it isn't, unfortunately, in the United States. Not at all. It's going primarily to the rich. But even if it were distributed, if it's less than 5%, over time, capitalism is going to diverge. We know that now. We know there's an aberration, however. There's an aberration historically. This is shown by Piketty in his book, Capital in the 21st Century. During this period, 1913 to 2012, there was a change. There was a change in that because, well, back in this radical period where this crazy man named Dwight D. Eisenhower, the marginal tax rate was 90%. Truman, Eisenhower, John Kennedy, some of these really far-out leftist people, they actually had taxes to support a balanced budget. They had taxes to support services. But we can't do this alone. We can't do this alone. We need to have innovation in economic theory. It's not going to work just to provide more economic inclusion on campus. So here's an example of how we need to innovate. And I'm talking, when I say we, I don't include myself among this cohort, but economists, professional economists, have to start getting it right, for heaven's sakes, when they're talking about basic statistics. You see these kind of charts all the time. You see, okay, comparing 1913, these are the wealth shares in 1913, and this is how it's changing for the top 1%. And here it is in 2012. It's apples to apples, right? And you see it again here. This is published in Fortune magazine. It's talking about U.S. income distribution in 1774, 1860, and 2010, right? Interestingly, if you're a white guy, not if you're black, but if you're a white guy in 1774, it's far more equal society. That's what de Tocqueville was admiring, the French writer who came and surveyed America. It was much more equal society back then when this country was founded for white people, okay? It was even more equal because you could be a pioneer too, and you could go get your 640 acres, right? But still, the problem here is that we're talking about apples to apples as if the top 1%, the top 5%, and the top 10%, we can talk about from age to age as if that's the same. But we can't. We need to have economists who face the reality that the relative power of the rich in today's society is far, far greater than at any time in history, okay? Let me show you. The baseline is bigger. This is a guy in Portland. He's called the Blanket Man. He's actually got a little bit of strange fame. Totally broke. But his status in the world is no different than the poorest beggar in Rome. Now, but look at what's happened over time with the power of the very richest. Isabel of Castile, back during the Columbus era, she owned 3% of the world's GDP. That's pretty rich. But what could she do? She could build a wooden boat and send it over the horizon, and she'd lost contact with the explorers. That's what she could do with all that money. Move the clock forward. Okay, it's a little more advanced. Instead of building a wooden boat, we build a wooden airplane. Okay, it's called the Spruce Goose, built by Howard Hughes. All right, but when people flew away from that, there was a little bit of radio communications if you were rich, but generally speaking, communications still had not been developed. But today, the very richest people, they can shoot rockets out to outer space. They have far more power than at any time in history. They not only have power to go explore the heavens, they have power over us as individuals. We have actually people in this society, can you believe it, are actually paying these rich guys to put little devices in your house so that they can listen to what the hell's going on in your bedroom. I'm sorry. The scope of power of the richest people in this world is far, 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 far greater than at any time in history. And so we need to have economists invent a new kind of metric. Not just saying that it's apples to apples. This is the way it was for the richest quartile in 1774 or 1860 or whatever. Because they need to meld Moore's law. And this is, by the way, the curve is far more exponential because on the left side is actually a logarithmic scale. But you still see it curving upward. Somehow merging Moore's law with the economic law, the economic differences across our population from poorest to richest, to talk about the social power curve. Some economist needs to invent the social power curve. Well, we meld these two things, which is the accelerating power of technology, and obviously the richest have the greatest technology. They have access now to quantum computing and so on. And what that implies across a society. And you can see that I've depicted this as green in the Columbus era, red in World War II, and blue today. Dramatic change. Economists need to give us accurate information. They need to give us more illuminating information if we're going to solve this problem. Another thing that's really important is they've got to get it right. Okay? They're not getting it right. Remember I showed you that cathedral? I talked about that as infrastructure investment. Everybody had access to the cathedral. This is a converging force in the society. So for example, it's got nothing to do with class envy. I got a house that's right here. I'm making, my total wealth is $10,000. Nice little cabin right there on the river. And I see the mountains. Wow, I'm a happy guy. It doesn't bother me so much that there's a guy behind me higher up on the hill with $100,000 in wealth. He's got a better view and so on, but that's not the problem. But if the society actually introduces infrastructure, they introduce the cathedral at the time, they introduce the highway system, they introduce free education for all. If that lifts all of us, say, in this example, by $250,000, we all lift the same. And that's a converging force because the difference between my wealth and this other gentleman's wealth is not 10 to 1 anymore. It's 400,000 to, say, 350,000, okay? So it's a converging force. In terms of percentages, I'm actually closer now as a consequence of infrastructure investment. Economists have to get this right.
And those people who say it's pork barrel, what's more wasteful? The waste of life and property and hope? Which is more wasteful? Or a multi-purpose project which can be used by all of our people? Which is more wasteful? To fail to tap the energies of that river, to let that water flood, to deny this chance for the development of recreation and power, or to use it, and to use it wisely? Which is more wasteful? To let the land wash away, to let it lie arid, or to use it, and use it wisely, and to make those investments which will make this a richer state and country in the years to come? These projects produce wealth. They bring industry. They bring jobs. And the wealth they bring brings wealth to other sections of the United States. This state had about 200,000 cars. 1929, it has 1 million cars now. They weren't building this state. They were building Detroit. As this state's income rises, so does the income of Michigan. And as the income of Michigan rises, so does the income of the United States. A rising tide lifts all the boats. And as Arkansas becomes more prosperous, so does the United States.
Okay, what did he say? He said a rising tide lifts all boats, but he was talking about the cathedrals. He was talking about infrastructure. He was talking about raising all people. That's the metaphor. A rising tide lifts everyone, but lifts them equally. Well, this metaphor, this beautiful metaphor, has been co-opted for bad public policy. And part of the fault is economists themselves. They're sloppy. These are some great universities. University of Michigan, that's where I went to grad school. University of California, Davis, Princeton University, okay? They got it wrong. They're saying, okay, if the GNP goes up, then a rising tide lifts all boats. No, that's not what Kennedy was saying. In fact, GNP growth exacerbates divergence when income and wealth are spread unequally, and I'll prove this to you. So again, back to the metaphor where we have my little cabin here, and you have the other fat cat up on the hill, 10,000, 100,000. GNP doubles, and all of a sudden, I get to double my position in life. I'm good. There's no class envy here. I'm twice as better off as I was before. Well, this other gentleman has gone from 100,000 to 200,000. So instead of a $90,000 gap, now we've got a $180,000 gap. And if it happens again, I'm making my progress, right? The rising tide lifts all boats. No. You see what's happening structurally to that slope? What's the problem with that? Does anybody have a clue as to what the problem is? What Hawking's talking about structurally here? Let me show you. That's the problem, structural risk. And if Kennedy were alive today, he'd say, steepest slopes trigger avalanches that wipe out all houses. That's what he'd say. And that's what economists have to get right. We need help. We need economists to get it straight. Okay, so these traditional violent levelers currently lie dormant. There's no potential alternative mechanisms for equalization. Will the future be different? I think it can be because, first of all, you're aware of the problem now. You're aware of the bigger problem in which you play. To the extent that you take whatever you're doing and you say it's time, it is time to disrupt higher education. It's time to change how we talk about prestige. That's very interesting. The roots of this word prestige, prestidigitation, are illusion and trick. Okay, so when U.S. News & World Report tries to tell you that Harvard, Princeton, and Yale are the most important universities in the world, wrong! UCSD is the most important because you are addressing this critical problem. You and the other institutions who are lifting people out of poverty, you are the potential clue to solving this problem. Thank you very much.